Welcome to part 2 on our video related to Art Nouveau, Fauvism, and Expressionism. As I talked about earlier in part 1, we are entering the 20th century, and we really do see art changing drastically. Art provides this very sharp break with the past and the whole evolution of Western art. It started to take an extreme when Courbet and Manet and artists like them began in the 19th century portraying contemporary life rather than historical events. So that was a pretty significant change. 20th century art not only declared all subjects fair game, it also liberated form, as in Cubism, and we will learn about that when we look at the work of Picasso, from traditional rules and freed color, and Fauvism, which is what we're going to look at in a minute, from accurately representing an object. Modern artists defied conversations with a vengeance, heeding Gauguin's demand for a break of all the old windows, even if we cut our fingers in the glass. At the core of this philosophy of rejecting the past, called modernism, was a relentless quest for radical freedom of expression. Released from the need to please a patron, the artist stressed private concerns, experiences, and imagination as the sole source of art. Art gradually moved away from any pretense of rendering nature toward pure abstraction where form, line, and color dominate. So we'll really start to see some really extreme paintings and sculptures pretty soon. So the movement of Fauvism really pushed this idea of the formal element of color to an extreme. It was one of the first avant-garde movements that flourished in France in the early years of the 20th century. The Fauve painters were the first to break away with Impressionism, as well as with older traditional methods of perception. Their spontaneous, often subjective response to nature was expressed in bold, undisguised brushstrokes and very high-key, vibrant colors directly from the tube, so they didn't do a lot of mixing. Henri Matisse was a French artist who introduced unnaturalistic color and vivid brushstrokes into his paintings in the summer of 1905. Working in a small fishing port off the Mediterranean coast, they had an exhibition that year at the Salon des Ottomans in Paris, and it, people obviously were hostile and didn't understand this exhibition, again, as we've seen viewers react when a new movement comes around. And one critic, Louis Vauxelles, called them fauves, or wild beasts. Again, it wasn't meant to be flattering, but they ended up adapting the name. And so this is one of the pieces that Matisse exhibited at that exhibition. It's called Woman with Hat, and I really do think you can get a sense of the unusual colors that he was using. I mean, we started to see that with Gauguin and Vincent van Gogh, but I think here he's really pushing these sort of, colors that you wouldn't expect in the composition. So the Fauves were a loosely shaped group of artists that shared a similar approach to nature, but they had no definitive program. Their leader was Matisse, who had arrived at the Fauve style after early experimenting with various styles. So he did, in turn, experiment with post-impressionist styles like Van Gogh, Gauguin, and Cézanne. And these influences clearly inspired him to reject traditional three-dimensional space and seek instead a new picture space defined by the movement of color planes. In 1906, Matisse finished what is often considered his greatest Fauve painting, called The Joy of Life. It is a large-scale painting depicting an Arcadian landscape filled with brilliantly colored forests, meadow, and sea and sky, and populated by new figures, both at rest and in motion. As with the earlier Fauve canvases, color is responsive only to emotional expression and the formal needs of the canvas, not the realities of nature. So again, he's really trying to respond to emotion as opposed to trying to render something natural and illusionistically correct. The references are many, but in form and date, the joy of life is closest to Cézanne's last great image of the bathers. So here are some examples. Here's the bathers that we looked at earlier. So I definitely think you can see how he was influenced by Paul Cézanne. And as well, he was also influenced by older styles. Clearly, Engres's Le Grand Odalisque, and Titian, again, seems to be an artist that inspires many modern 19th century modern artists. Like Cézanne, Matisse constructs the landscape so that it functions as a stage. In both works, trees are planted at the sides and in the far distance, and their upper bows are spread apart like curtains, highlighting the figures lounging beneath. So let me kind of go back so you can kind of see that. So it really does sort of look like this stage where this sort of scene is unfolding. Sorry. Hush! And like Cézanne, Matisse unifies the figures and the landscape. Cézanne does this by stiffening and tilting his trunk-like figures. Hush! In Matisse's work, the Serpentine Arabesque is what defines the contours of the woman, and those are heavily emphasized and reiterate the curvilinear lines of the tree. So going back, you can really see how these curved lines really mimic some of these curved lines in the landscape. Matisse created wildly sensual figures in Joy of Life, which show how he was clearly informed by Engres's Odalisque and these sort of ideas of exotic harem fantasies. Matisse references Titian, for like Titian's image above, the Bacchanal of the Adrians. Bacchanal is sort of like a worshipping of the goddess of the goddess of or wine, Bacchus. The scene depicted in Joy of Life is an expression of pure pleasure. Here is a place full of life and love and free from want or fear. Instead of a contemporary scene in a park, on the banks of the Seine, or on a recognizable place in nature, Matisse has returned to this sort of mythic paradise. Okay, so let me go back so you can kind of see and compare and contrast. So here are some details. Looks like some interesting stuff going on. But don't be misled by this interest in myth and in terms of him being referencing Titian. Matisse really is trying to go against this idea of the salon artist. And the idea of Fauvism was supposed to be a radical new approach that incorporated purely expressive, bright, clear colors and wildly sensual forms. Matisse's paintings, perhaps the first canvas to clearly understand Cézanne's great formal challenge and to actually further the elder master's ideas. So he's really, in a lot of ways, pushing some of the conventions and ideas that Cézanne had about color, had about planes and sort of depicting space. He was really interested in, showing space from multiple points of view, or this idea when we stand in a different direction, it changes, or a different spot and look at the same subject, it changes and looks different. So this painting became very well known, and Matisse became known briefly as probably the most daring painter in Paris during this time. So let's talk about some specifics about why this particular canvas is so daring. There's one key issue to consider. Unlike the paintings by Cézanne, Engres, and Titian, Matisse's work does not depict forms that recede into the background and diminish in scale. If you study the figures in the foreground and the middle ground of Joy of Life, you will notice that their scale is badly skewed. The shift of scale between the player of the double flute, bottom center, and the smooching couple, bottom right, is plausible if we take the musician to be a child, if we take the musicians to be like the size of a child. But what of the giants just behind them? Compared to these figures standing in the wings, who are obviously mature women. Middle ground left. These center women are enormous proportion, and they are simply too big to make sense within the traditional conventions of Western painting. I'll get back so you can see the whole canvas again. So this is the parts that we're referring to. And then again, we kind of move up here, and you know, it just doesn't make sense in terms of illusionistic perspective, or, you know, linear perspective. Sorry, I should have talked about this slide. So this is what they're talking about, these two sort of mature women, and then you have these figures in the background, and it just, you know, in relation to scale, it just doesn't quite fit reality. So why does Matisse play around with these ideas of space? How could these shifts of scale make sense? Have we seen anything like this before? Well, if we look back at Cézanne's painting, he did try to rupture forms in order to accurately explore vision as experienced through time and space. In other words, forms looking different depending on where we are in relation to them. So, you know, Cézanne really wanted to understand this idea of seeing the way people really do see. And, you know, no one just stands in one spot and looks at something for a significant amount of time. You know, our point of view is constantly changing, and I think that's what Cézanne was trying to capture. And Matisse is sort of following suit. In fact, the exploration of vision through space is the key to understanding Matisse's work. By incorporating shifting perspectives, he brought this idea to a grand scale. Put simply, Matisse's shifting scale is actually the result of our changing position vis-a-vis the figures. As a result of his experimentation with perspective, the viewer relates differently to the painting and is required to enter the scene. It is only from the varied perspective within this landscape that the abrupt rupture of scale makes sense. So this painting was purchased by a wealthy expatriate American writer-poet named Gertrude Stein, and her brother Leo Stein. You probably, if you've taken any sort of literature class, I'm sure you've read their work, or her work. And, you know, her home was magnificent. It was filled with modern art. She lived in Paris, and she was friends with all sorts of writers and musicians and artists, and she really held this, you know, this position of, you know, she really kind of was the leader of this intellectual group of artists, and they would have parties, and they would sit around, and they would talk about art, and, you know, just all these different ideas stirring around, I guess, in the 20th century. And so they would have these sort of weekly meetings. Here, Matisse and a largely unknown Picasso and other members of the avant-garde came together to exchange ideas. So this was important too, because you have these famous artists sort of interacting with each other, competing with each other, but also exchanging ideas as well. Stein was able to attract such a crowd not only because of her literary skill, but because she often provided financial support to these nearly destitute artists. In fact, the Steins bought Matisse, Joy of Life, soon after its completion and hung it in their dining room for all to see. One person who saw it was Picasso, and we're looking at his work on the right. By all accounts, the painting's fame was too much for this terribly competitive young Spaniard. He, determined to outdo Matisse, did in 1907 with his canvas Demoiselles d'Avignon. We'll talk about this one later, and we are going to be talking a lot about Picasso when we get into Cubism. Picasso turned Matisse's sensuality into almost violent pornography, as some critics have described. Something that was unsettling for critics was the depiction of the nude female, but also these faces, which looked very mask-like and looked almost like primitive, like African masks. And that was something that Pablo Picasso was inspired by. So it really kind of was very revolutionary. Matisse, in turn, responds to Picasso's challenge of what was then called primitivism, with his own brand of aggression in this later picture he did called the Blue Nude, right here. And so this is an example of these sort of artists and their egos, you know, trying to outdo one another. This is a quote by Matisse. "What I dream of is an art devoid of troubling or depressing subject matter, which might be for every mental worker, be he businessman or writer, like a mental comforter, something like a good armchair in which to rest." So